I grew up in a very conservative household. My father was an aspiring politician, stood twice for federal parliament and was unsuccessful. We grew up in a Liberal Party household where any politics that was discussed was really anti-Labor, pro-Liberal. There weren't any great involved in depth debates about what was right or what was wrong. I was just sold the idea as I was growing up that the only party that you could belong to, the only party that made any sense in our family was the Liberal Party. Now my father was also mayor of a local council area for about 10 years. He was very successful. Well, he was a great community man, in fact, and I'm not going to criticise him for any of the choices that he made, but there certainly were possibly unspoken elements about racism, Indigenous people, people that were of a lower class. But even though my father, this is the contradiction, worked in a pharmacy in a working class, two pharmacies he had in a working class area here in Adelaide, and he had a great rapport with those people that came in to seek medications and so forth in his shops. He understood people, there's no doubt about that, and it was clear that people liked him. But his politics was extreme right wing. Now I don't know how those two areas conflicted with him. I never had a conversation with him about that. In fact, we talked about very little in relation to politics in particular, and talked very little generally, I think. But nevertheless, that was the way I was raised. And I can remember at one point when I was about mid-30s, chose to actually have a look at joining the Liberal Party, and I went to training programs, media training type programs, and got right involved with it, and attempted to stand for pre-selection in one of the Liberal Party seats, which I was unsuccessful at, thank God. But the point I wanted to make was that I grew up thinking only Liberal. That was my bubble. It was the bubble in which all the people that my father knew and that I knew were involved. In fact, when my father was standing for the Senate, I and another mate, who was also part of the Young Liberals, went around and removed some of the opposition signs that were on fences and stuff. Got a little bit of trouble for doing that. I can remember on one occasion going to a talk by the then Premier of South Australia, who was a Liberal person. His name was Don Dunstan, very famous man, simply because he was a progressive. And I can remember sitting in the front row with him and ridiculing him, saying things that I thought were really smart but weren't. Probably made me look rather silly. He dismissed me. It was rather an embarrassing moment, but I thought I needed to do that to protect my father, perhaps, to exhibit some sort of authority over what I saw at the time as being unhelpful, not democratic, not politically correct. So I made my stand as a conservative around those issues, not really knowing, I think, what I actually thought. It was like I was just following the crowd, like I was just doing what I thought my father was doing was right, and I just followed suit, wanting probably to impress him at the end of the day. And then I decided that after I'd left my first wife, done this political thing, and then met up with my current wife, and decided that it was about time I just needed to take a different direction in my life. So I'd had a strong Christian background, was on the right of politics, was a bit lost or bewildered, I guess, as towards my own beliefs and how I saw things generally. And then I decided that I would take a direction that was completely different, which was going back to school. I didn't pass any exams or any tests at all while I was at school, and go and get my high school certificate. And while I was doing that, I was also I became involved with Lifeline, which is a free counselling service here in Australia. And as I started to explore all of that, it was like, there wasn't like this one moment where I had an epiphany. It was like a gradual process that I took, where for the first time in my life I started to talk to and began to understand the experiences that other people were having. I can remember when I was at Lifeline, in about my first week actually on the phones after the training, I had about 5 suicides in progress. So there are many people who work for Lifeline as counsellors for decades who never have a lifeline of suicide. And I had 5 in the same week. And it was like being thrown in to the counselling experience in the deep end. But I handled each one of those calls appropriately, hopefully saved some lives. And I began to understand that there were people who viewed the world completely different to me. They had different experiences. I grew up in this conservative household that didn't have any real issues, weren't any marriage breakups until my own. And then decided that this was an interesting experience, that I enjoyed this opportunity of talking to other people. And it was at this moment that my thinking around politics and how I viewed the world completely changed. I became conscious of others' experiences as opposed to just my own. And I found that by listening to them, by understanding what they were saying, and in the most basic counselling technique you can imagine, just reflecting back and echoing what they're saying, I found it made a difference. I connected with people, and it was a fabulous experience. In fact, I remember clearly wanting to go to the counselling sessions, to go to the training, to learn as much as I could about this wonderful experience that I was having. It released in me a yearning to understand a different world. And as I was doing this, now that I'm reflecting back, I can see myself moving away from this bubble that I had been living in. My wife was an academic. She went back to university. She started university when she left school. She went back to university. She got her degree, got an advanced degree, master's degree, and then eventually got a PhD. Now, the conversations that I started to have with Dee were different from any other conversations I had before. They were illuminating. They were about who I was and how I saw myself in this world. And I came to one interesting conclusion, and that was, for the first 40 years of my life, I lived in a vacuum without any real insight into the experiences that other people had and how those experiences impacted not only how they felt about themselves, but how they perceived their world. And then there became a growing need to want to be able to make changes in people's lives. Initially, from a counselling and social work perspective, a therapeutic perspective, in fact. That is where I decided I wanted to be. And I began working at I'll just go prior to that. My first placement was, which was back in the mid-90s, as a student. Remembering I was a mature age student, obviously, but my first placement was working in child protection, whereby I saw some of the worst behaviours of social workers that you could imagine. And I can remember on one occasion walking into a lunchroom, and a bunch of the social workers were standing around and they were talking about clients as being feral. And I couldn't understand this. I'd come to this belief from my social work training that people weren't feral. They were just people. They were people struggling with whatever it was that they were struggling with. And they were battling with looking after their kids. But they weren't feral. I felt that was an insulting thing to say about these people. And I came out as a new social worker. This is my third year as a social work student. And I came out and said, no, you can't do that. You can't. And I really went off at them. I kind of lost my cool at them. And they were sitting back thinking, you know, who is this student telling us how we should be thinking and working and so forth? And as I worked more and more in the child protection space, I came to realise this is not a place where I want to work. There's an irony in this, which I'll tell you about in just a moment, but I didn't want to work in child protection because these people that I was working with were toxic and I didn't like the environment and so on. And I worked with a number of clients during that period, and kind of today wonder where some of those kids are that I worked with. But nevertheless, I left there, had one more year of social work to go, and then worked in my final placement in the break-even gambling rehabilitation program, which was set up just at that particular time because gambling here in Australia is an issue, in South Australia in particular, and they just introduced poker machines into hotels, and gambling was way out of control. And I worked with Relationships Australia and had one of the most worst experiences I could ever imagine. So I'm telling you this because this formulates my version of the world and why some of the things I do and say now are really important to me. And that experience that I had, I worked with a woman whose name I will not mention. This is over 30 years ago, so who knows whether she's still around. But she came from what you can only describe as a wealthy family. I won't give much more detail than that because she could be identified, and she was the worst social worker I've ever met. And over the years I met some terrible ones. And she taught down to people, she ignored their experiences, she only saw things from her perspective, she never saw them from the client's perspective. I sat with her on a number of occasions. She would send students that had worked there, because she was in charge of the students that attended Relationships Australia, and there were stories about students, particularly women, going off and crying after having their work reviewed by her. And she was horrible. And so I objected to this to my supervisor at school and suggested I wanted to change, and I did. I started to work for Anglicare, who were running the same program but out north, and I found a much better experience. The social workers that I was working with, there were two of them, were fabulous. And then eventually when I left my placement, I began working there as a paid worker. And that experience initially was a good experience for me. The point was though that, I don't know whether this is too much information, but I was actually I had already, up until this point, I'd been a counsellor for over 6 years. Through my Lifeline training, and while I was at Lifeline, I trained people in counselling. I ran the training program. So I had a fair depth of experience around counselling, knew what it should look like, and also knew what it shouldn't look like. And so when I stepped into that role, by the time I'd left Relationships Australia, I knew what we should be doing. And frankly, I was pretty good at it. It was never acknowledged by my boss that I received no supervision, no one saw what I was doing. I actually on one occasion decided that if I'm not going to get supervised, I'll ask a client, get permission from them to video a session so that I can look at me. It wasn't about her. So I could look at me and watch what I was doing, and I was quite horrified at some of the body language and some of the things that I said, and so I used that in order to change some of those behaviours. So they're the things I did to improve myself. Also at the same time, I was hungry for information about how to work, how I should be as a social worker, and what other work I should be doing. So I started working as a part-time paid job at Relationships Australia, running some courses around anger management, divorce and separation. In fact, over the about 10-year period, I wrote about 25 different programs which I ran through through Relationships Australia. And I also ran another program through them, which was the lifestyle program, which was run for Vietnam veterans and other veterans, as it turned out, as that program progressed. And I loved it. I loved the group work. I loved being creative. I've always held that you can be, the greatest asset that we've got is that we can use everything we have as an experiment. We can test it out. Clients don't know that you're testing it out. I tested out lots of stuff. Some worked. The stuff that did work was fabulous and revolutionised the way I practiced as a social worker. But there were many disputes about the extra work I was doing. So I'd take time off, so I'd take holidays, and during that week that I had a holiday period, I'd go off and run a program for Relationships Australia for the Vietnam veterans. During the week, sometimes 3 or 4 nights a week, I would be out running courses at Relationships Australia. So I had my day job, I had all these other things I was doing. And my kids will say, you know, Dad, you just weren't home. And I wasn't, and I was wrong, and I became obsessive about the things I needed to learn and my creativity and what was working and what wasn't working and the experiments that we were doing with people. It was great. And I worked with some fabulous people on a group that I started called the Confronting Violence Abuse Group, which led into, this is early in the piece, which was about domestic violence. And we did some creative stuff with them, which I've written about in the ASW journal. So that was back in 2010. So I've done a lot. And so I've moved from that conservative version of me, which was the kid, and wanting to impress my father, wanting to become important, I guess, but with no real background or intellectual understanding as to what I was doing, zero. It wasn't until I went to university, met my wife, which was prior to university, but met Dee, and then we started that journey together about rediscovering who we are. And the interesting thing about meeting my wife is that she was a foster kid. So she had a completely different experience of life than what I did. And as time went by, I became more and more concerned about the way social workers were working and tried to raise the alarm around that, and then found that the more I became concerned, the more I pushed back against the organisation that I was working with, which was Anglicare, and the better I became, I think, at what I was doing and more assertive, they took as me being aggressive. And there was this thing I used to say that every year the HR would pull me into the office and wrap me across the knuckles for certain things. And on one particular occasion, I went away for a week. I was on leave, that's right. It was over Christmas, and we take holidays during that time anyway. And when I came back, my manager, who's the most terrible person, not a social worker, had no idea what she was doing in the job, but certainly had power and control over me and was a bully. And she plonked this letter in front of me, which had listed 5 areas of indiscretions that I had done. And I won't go through all of them now, I can't even remember all of them. But the point being was that they dragged me in front of an HR committee. It was horrendous. I was crying. I couldn't believe that I was being ripped apart in this way. And it was just devastating. I sat in front of a committee. She was on the committee. They reprimanded me. I filed a workplace bullying compensation claim through, and then it escalated. There were lots of conversations with WorkSafe SA and trying to deal with that particular issue. And in the end, they decided that, so I went on leave for about 6 months, and at the end of the day, they decided that it was about time I left. And during that period, I remember sitting at the back of the place, home, with my wife, and just bursting into tears. I'd lost it. I was sad. I was crying. I was suicidal. And I told Dee that, and she became quite concerned. And we said, "We've got to finish this. You can't keep going on this way." So I decided to leave and take up some work that I'd been offered with the Vietnam Vets Counselling Service, as it was back then, and do some counselling with them as a contractor, and still do some of this contract work with Relationships Australia, and to start my own private practice, which I did. That's now about 25 years ago. And it was strange because it's quite a leap going from a regular income, which was pretty poorly paid anyway, to actually think about having no income and going into private practice. And then soon after that, some years later, social workers became accredited mental health social workers, so I applied for that and got that. Therefore I could charge through Medicare. But that first year was going to be a struggle. But then when I did my accounts at the end of that year, I discovered that I was actually earning 3 times more than I was working for Anglicare, because there were so many benefits from having your own business. And I had some really interesting contracts, and my practice progressed, and I did lots of other things. Travelled interstate a lot. Did some work which I regret doing. Some of the most high-paid work I did was actually in Queensland. But nevertheless, from all of that, I discovered who I was. And the other final issue, I guess, that I need to talk to you about was when I was in 2015, up until for a few years prior to that, I'd started working with people who'd been systematically abused by the Department of Child Protection. And I decided that I was going to do more and more of that work. Started to advocate a lot for people. Most of that was free work. Became really involved in that, really concerned about kids and how they were being treated through the system, and how parents were being treated by the system, particularly by my colleagues, social workers. And so I decided that I was going to focus more on that. And then I attended a meeting with the Chief Executive Officer for the Department of Child Protection, who was the most revolting individual you could ever imagine. He was an abusive, arrogant man. I won't say where he came from, but he was terrible. And in that meeting, he abused me when I asked a question about a case that I knew of where the kids were being abused. And I broke down in tears because I was so surprised. And then I left that meeting, came back, he didn't say anything, the meeting went on. I left afterwards, met some of my colleagues that were in that meeting, and said, that's it, I've had enough. And I started a party called the Child Protection Party, which still is in existence to this day. And we started that in January 2016. And I ran for Parliament on a couple of occasions. The point is, that's my story. Now, there are some people who come onto my YouTube channel who object greatly to the things that I say, particularly the things that I feel are unjust. Calling out Donald Trump for being a buffoon, for example, when he is, and being angry, expressing my anger about injustices, when I have, for the last 35 years, not only had injustices levelled at me about who I was, and who I was as a social work practitioner, that I understand injustices. I see so many injustices with the clients that I work with who just don't receive services, where parents with the Department of Child Protection are blamed for what's happening for their children, when in many cases there's situations which can be dealt with. that can possibly be managed, but aren't. So, and then particularly I think the mother blaming, that really gets me. That we blame women for everything. And these things have been highlighted in my life. They're things I've become conscious of, extremely aware of, and are things that I've fought to change. So when I see people that are bullying, I think of a case where, you know, I was bullied when I was at Anglicare and how that impacted me. It was devastating to the point that I was suicidal. And I feel for those people that are bullied. I feel for those people that are denigrated. Now, if I'd stayed as I was back in my early 20s and just saw myself as this person who had to dislike anything that was anti-liberal, that is, the Liberal Party, anything that was anti-conservative, I would have been totally useless, brainwashed. I could not see the wider perspective that sits in this world that we all need to take care of. And I see people on my YouTube channel who have a go at me for TDS and all this other stuff that I might say because I say things that are contradictory to what they believe. Too bad. I don't care anymore about what criticisms you offer about me. My life experience tells me what I believe is ethically correct. Not because I've just wandered into things in a sort of absent-minded manner, but because I've experienced those things. And when you've experienced abuse, and it sits inside of you still, like there's people I haven't mentioned yet that have tried to damage me, have tried to destroy me in every possible way they could. Even a guy that I saw as my best mate tried to destroy me. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I chose to be different. Because I chose not to accept the status quo. Now that doesn't mean that I have to agree with everything that is to the left, just like I don't agree with everything that's to the right. What it does mean is that when I see something that's inequitable or unfair or harms another group of people, because of my experiences, I'm going to make a stand. You may not like the stand I make, but all I can do is say to you, come out of that bubble. It doesn't mean you have to be progressive. It doesn't mean you have to be even left of centre. What it does mean is that you need to find a different way to look at the world. Look, if a left-leaning politician such as Anthony Albanese or some other politician or an extreme left like Adam Brandt from the Greens, if they say or do something that I think is wrong, I will say it is wrong because it disadvantages a specific group, particularly a minority. And I will say it's wrong because I know it hurts to be in the minority. And it hurts to be attacked. And it hurts to be denigrated. So I will make a stand because I know what it feels like. So that's who I am. I'm not asking you to like me because of what I've just said. I don't care. But I do ask you to try and understand where I come from. Because for me, moving from conservatism to a progressive version of who we are is paramount to redefining not just my life, but being able to assist others to move on with theirs. Thanks everybody for being with me, and please remember to subscribe, ring the bell for further notifications. In the meantime, take care, look after yourselves, the people that you love, and be safe.